While I was making coffee in the kitchen one morning, the private airstrip guard called me and said, "Sir, your son is here. He forced his way in, and he's destroying the aircraft and everything else on the property." I calmly replied, "Let him do it." I just smiled, sent a message to my lawyer saying, "Begin step 2, and my son had no idea that the private airstrip he was destroying actually belonged to. Thank you so much for joining me on Dad's Revenge Stories. I would love to know where my audience is located today. Drop your city or country in the comments. Please remember, this tale contains fictional elements designed to entertain and educate. Resemblances to actual events or identities are entirely coincidental, but the takeaway is profoundly practical. I remember that detail clearly, the way the smell of dark roast filled the kitchen, the way the morning light came through the window above the sink and stretched across the wooden floor in long, pale strips. I had lived in this house for 23 years, and that kitchen had always been the place where the day felt manageable, quiet, mine. I was 72 years old. I had flown combat missions over places most people could not find on a map. I had pulled injured climbers off the side of mountains in weather that would ground younger pilots. I had buried my wife and kept moving because that was the only thing left to do. I was not a man who frightened easily, but when the phone rang that morning and I saw Frank Dalton's name on the screen, something old and instinctive moved through my chest. The kind of feeling you get when an instrument reading tells you something is wrong before you can see it with your own eyes. I answered on the second ring. "Frank." His voice came through uneven, like a man trying to hold himself together and losing the effort. "Mr. Cole, sir, I need you to listen to me carefully." "I'm listening." "Your son is here." A pause. I could hear machinery in the background. Heavy machinery. "He came in about 40 minutes ago. He had a crew with him, truck's equipment. He cut the lock on the main gate and drove straight through." Another pause, longer this time. "Sir, they're tearing up the runway. They brought in a bulldozer, and they're going after the plane." I set my coffee mug down on the counter. I did not slam it. I set it down carefully, the way you handle things when your hands know, before your mind does, that you need to stay steady. "The beaver?" I asked. Frank's voice cracked at the edges. "Yes, sir. I tried to stop them. I stood in front of the equipment, and Derek, your son, he told me to get off the property or he would call the sheriff and have me removed. He had papers, Mr. Cole. Looked like official documents. Transfer forms, demolition permits. He was waving them around, telling everyone the land was his now and you had already signed it over." I walked to the kitchen window. Outside, the morning was still and bright, the kind of April morning in Montana that makes you forget winter was ever real. The mountains sat where they always sat, solid and indifferent, and the sky above them was the particular shade of blue that Eleanor used to call honest. "Mr. Cole." Frank's voice came through the phone again, tighter now. "Sir, what do you want me to do? Should I call the police? Should I?" "Frank," I said, "listen to me." "Yes, sir." "Go stand by the north fence. Don't engage with anyone. Don't touch anything. Don't let anyone see you on your phone." I kept my voice even the way I used to keep it even on approach in bad crosswind conditions, when panic was the one thing you could not afford. "Can you do that?" A beat of silence. "Yes, sir. But the plane." "I know about the plane, Frank." I closed my eyes for exactly 3 seconds. "Just do what I said. I'll handle it from here." I ended the call. I stood in my kitchen for a moment that felt longer than it was. The coffee maker beeped twice behind me, finished with its work. Outside, a hawk turned slow circles above the ridgeline, riding a thermal I could not see from where I stood. My son was destroying the runway I had built and maintained for 2 decades. He was crushing the aircraft I had spent 9 years restoring with my own hands. He had forged my signature on documents and shown them to my employees and announced to anyone who would listen that the property was already his. And I was standing in my kitchen, and my coffee was getting cold, and I was smiling. Not because it didn't hurt. It hurt in ways I am still not sure I have words for, the kind of hurt that lives in the space between what you hoped a person would be and what they turned out to be. That space in Derek's case had been growing for years. I had just refused to measure it until now. I smiled because Derek had just done exactly what I had spent 3 months waiting for him to do. I picked up my phone and opened my messages and typed 11 words to the one person who had been waiting just as long as I had. Maggie. He moved. Start step 2. I sent it, set the phone face down on the counter, and poured myself a full cup of coffee. My son thought he had just won. He had no idea that the ground he was tearing apart had never been his to claim, and that every piece of that destruction was being recorded, catalogued, and preserved by people he did not know existed. He had no idea that the documents he was waving around would be examined by federal forensic analysts within 48 hours. He had no idea that the runway he was grinding into rubble was not, and had never been, private property at all. He was so certain he had outmaneuvered a 72-year-old man with a coffee mug and a quiet life. What Derek did not understand, what he had perhaps never understood about me, was that the pilots who last the longest are never the ones who react fastest. They are the ones who read the situation correctly before anyone else does, and then they wait steady and patient for exactly the right moment to act. I had read this situation 3 months ago. I had been waiting ever since. Outside my window, the hawk was gone. The sky was still that honest shade of blue. And somewhere across the valley, my son was destroying something he believed belonged to him, not knowing that he had just handed me everything I needed. I drank my coffee. It was still warm. The drive to the airstrip took 11 minutes. I know, because I watched the clock on the dashboard the entire way. The way I used to watch instrument panels on long mountain approaches, not out of anxiety, but because precision had always been the thing that kept me alive. 11 minutes of gravel road, winding through pine and scrub brush, and with every quarter mile the sound reached me before the sight did. The low, grinding moan of heavy machinery working against earth. The kind of sound that gets into your back teeth and stays there. I pulled off the road 50 yards short of the main gate and sat with the engine running. The fence had been cut clean, both sides of the gate pulled back and flattened into the mud like they had never existed. 3 large trucks were parked along the access road, and beyond them a bulldozer the size of a small house was making its second pass across what used to be the northern end of my runway. The packed gravel surface I had maintained for 20 years was gone, torn into ridges of broken earth that caught the morning light all wrong. Frank was standing by the north fence exactly where I had told him to be. His arms crossed tight against his chest. His jaw set so hard I could see the tension in it from where I sat. He was 61 years old and had worked this airstrip since I first opened it. And the look on his face was the look of a man watching something irreplaceable get fed into a machine. I got out of the truck. Derek saw me the moment my boots hit the gravel. He was standing near the hangar entrance with a man I did not recognize, heavy-set work jacket, clipboard in hand. That would be Russell Greer, I learned later. The owner of the demolition company Derek had hired 4 weeks earlier paid $40,000 up front from an account I had never seen before. My son walked toward me with the particular stride of someone who had rehearsed this moment and was pleased with how it was going so far. He was 44 years old, dressed in a jacket that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and he was smiling the way people smile when they believe the hard part is already over. "Dad." He said it like a greeting and a dismissal at the same time. I was wondering when you'd show up. Derek. I looked past him at the runway. The bulldozer had reached the southern section now, its blade biting into the base layer I had poured, and resurfaced twice over the years. How long has this been going on? About an hour. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded set of papers, holding them out toward me. Before you say anything, I want you to read these. Everything here is legal. Transfer of property demolition authorization county permits all signed and filed. You'll see your signature on page 3. I did not take the papers. I looked at my son's face instead, at the confidence sitting there, smooth and untroubled, and I thought about the 11-year-old boy who used to sit on the top rail of that fence and watch me run pre-flight checks on a Tuesday afternoon. The boy who made me promise once that he could fly with me when he was old enough. The boy I had driven 400 miles to see graduate from college, who had shaken my hand at the ceremony instead of hugging me, and I had told myself that was just who he had become. "Where's the plane?" I asked. Something shifted in Derek's expression, just slightly. Around the sides of the hangar. I walked around the side of the hangar. The de Havilland Beaver was on its left side in the mud. The fuselage caved in along the midsection, where the bulldozer had rolled across it. The left wing was gone, entirely sheared at the root and lying 20 feet away in a tangle of aluminum and control cable. The engine cowling had been pushed back into the firewall. 9 years of weekend work of sourcing original parts from salvage yards in 4 different states, of lying on cold concrete in January, because a repair could not wait, compressed into something that no longer resembled an aircraft at all. Frank appeared at my shoulder. His voice came out low and rough. "Mr. Cole, I'm sorry. I tried to." "You did what I asked," I said. "That's enough." I turned and walked back to where Derek was standing. He had the papers extended again, his chin lifted. His weight settled back on his heels the way it always was, when he was certain he held the stronger position. Russell Greer had drifted a few steps closer, watching with the careful attention of a man who was starting to wonder whether the situation was quite as clean as he had been told. "Dad, I know this is difficult," Derek said, "but this land has been sitting here doing nothing for years. The runway is a liability. The plane was already—" "Stop." I said it quietly, and he stopped. "I want to ask you one question, Derek. Just one." He spread his hands. "Go ahead. Did you read the survey documents before you started this morning?" A small hesitation. "We had everything reviewed. The title is clear." "That's not what I asked you." I looked at him steadily. "Did you personally read the original federal survey documents for this property, the ones filed in 1973? The confidence in his face did not disappear, but something behind it moved, some small, uncertain thing that he covered quickly with another layer of certainty. "The land belongs to the family, Dad. It always has." I nodded slowly. Behind him, the bulldozer made another pass. The sound of it ground through the morning air, heavy and final, the way doors sound when they close on things that cannot be reopened. "All right, Derek," I said. I turned and walked back to my truck. He called after me, his voice carrying across the lot, with the sharp edge of someone who expected a fight and was unsettled by not getting one. "That's it. You're just leaving." I opened the truck door and looked back at him across the roof. "I already did what I needed to do this morning," I said. "The rest is up to you." I drove back down the gravel road without looking in the rearview mirror. My hands were steady on the wheel. My chest was not, but that was between me and the 11 minutes back to the highway, and I did not owe anyone a front-row view of that particular reckoning. Derek thought I was walking away. He had no idea I had just watched him build his own case against himself, brick by brick, in front of cameras he never once looked up to find. I did not go straight home. I drove past the turnoff to my house and kept going up the county road that climbs the eastern ridge before it levels out at a wide gravel pullout, where you can see the whole valley at once. I had been parking there since before Derek was born. Eleanor used to bring a thermos of coffee and sit on the hood of whatever truck we owned at the time, and we would watch the light change on the mountains until one of us got cold enough to suggest going back. I sat there alone for a long time that morning, engine off, hands in my lap, looking at the valley below. 72 years is a long time to build something. It is also a long time to watch the people you love make choices you cannot make for them. I grew up in Billings, the second son of a man who repaired farm equipment for a living, and believed that a person's word was the only currency that could not be inflated away. My father shook hands on every agreement he ever made and never once failed to honor one. I do not say that to make him into something larger than he was. I say it because it is true, and because truth was the particular inheritance he left me. Not land, not money, just the understanding that a man who cannot be trusted has nothing regardless of what he owns. I enlisted at 18. I flew for the Army for 20 years, transport and rescue missions across 3 different continents, the kind of flying that does not make the news because it is supposed to be invisible. I learned in those years that the most important thing a pilot can do is not react. It is read. Read the weather, read the instruments, read the situation on the ground before you commit to anything. I learned in those years that the most important thing a pilot can do is not react, it is read. When I came home to Montana for good, I was 51 years old, and Eleanor had already picked out the land. It has to be flat enough for a runway, she told me the day we walked the property. She was standing in knee-high grass with her hands on her hips, squinting at the long level stretch that ran parallel to the tree line. "You'll go crazy without something to fly. I'm not building a runway," I told her. She looked at me the way she always looked at me when I said something she had already decided was wrong. I broke ground on the runway 6 months later. We spent 9 years on that property together before the cancer found her. 9 years of mornings that started with coffee and ended with whatever the day had brought. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, the airstrip became something more than a private indulgence. The county search and rescue team started using it for mountain operations. Forest Service crews staged equipment there when the roads closed in winter. A local medical transport company arranged access for emergency runs into the backcountry. Eleanor never once said "I told you so" about the runway. She just stood at the kitchen window every time I taxied out and watched until I was airborne, and when I came back, she had coffee waiting. She died on a Wednesday in November 11 years ago. I was with her. Derek flew in from Denver and arrived 4 hours after she was gone, and I have never asked him whether he could have come sooner because some questions do not have answers that help anyone. I started restoring the de Havilland Beaver the following spring. It was a wreck when I found it, a 1956 model that had spent 30 years in a barn outside of Missoula. The fabric rotted. The engine seized the instruments, long since stripped out by someone who needed the parts more than the plane. I bought it for $3,000 and spent 9 years and considerably more than that bringing it back. Derek came to the airstrip twice during those 9 years. The first time he walked around the fuselage with his hands in his pockets and asked how much it would be worth when it was finished. The second time he did not get out of his car. I thought about those 2 visits a lot sitting on that ridge that morning. I thought about the 8-year-old boy who used to climb the fence and watch me do pre-flight checks, who asked questions about every gauge and dial with the focused intensity of someone who genuinely needed to know. That boy had wanted to understand how things worked. Somewhere between 8 and 44, he had stopped wanting to understand things and started wanting to own them and I was not sure exactly when the shift had happened, or whether there was anything I could have done to stop it. What I was sure of was this: Derek had not become a different person. He had become a more complete version of the person he had been choosing to be for a long time. And I had loved him enough to keep not seeing it clearly, which was its own kind of failure, and one I had decided to stop repeating. I started the truck. The valley below was fully lit now, the morning sun clearing the eastern peaks and throwing long shadows across the basin. Somewhere down there, Derek was standing on the ruins of a runway he believed was his holding paperwork. He believed was legitimate, making plans he believed were already settled. He had been wrong about so many things for so long. I pulled back onto the road and headed home because Maggie Harlow was going to call within the hour, and there was a great deal of work left to do. Eleanor would have said, "Do what is right, Raymond, and do it without making it about yourself." She had a way of reducing things to their correct size. I was trying. 3 months before Frank Dalton called me about the bulldozers, I found the email. It was a Thursday evening in January, the kind of cold Montana night where the temperature drops fast enough after sunset that the windows fog from the inside and the house makes small contracting sounds in the walls, like it is settling in for the duration. Derek had driven up from Billings that afternoon, a surprise visit, he said, just checking in. We had dinner, said very little to each other that mattered, and he left around 8, telling me he had forgotten his laptop charger and would pick it up next time. He had not forgotten it. He had left it intentionally because he left in a hurry when his phone rang, and he stepped outside to take the call, and I heard him say through the kitchen window a number large enough to make a man move fast. The laptop was on the kitchen table. I am not a man who goes through other people's things. I want to be clear about that. I stood in the kitchen for a long time looking at that laptop before I opened it, and I understood exactly what kind of line I was crossing, and I crossed it anyway, because 72 years of reading situations had put something cold and certain in my chest that I had learned a long time ago not to ignore. The screen came to life without a password. The email application was open. The most recent message was from a company called Ridgeline Property Partners, dated that same afternoon. The subject line read, "Recall Airstrip Acquisition Final Terms." I read it standing up still in my coat, because I had not yet decided whether I was going to stay or walk away, and sitting down felt like a commitment. The email outlined a development agreement. A luxury resort and private residential community to be built on the Airstrip property and surrounding land. Total projected value of the development, $6.2 million. Developer contribution to acquisition costs already transferred in part. And at the bottom, in a separate paragraph under the heading Consultant Compensation, a figure that made my right hand grip the edge of the table. $780,000. Payable to Derek J. Cole personally upon successful transfer of title and completion of demolition. I stood there for what felt like a long time, but was probably less than 2 minutes. Then I closed the laptop, set it back exactly where it had been, walked to the living room, and sat in the chair by the window where Eleanor used to read. The mountains were invisible in the dark. The window gave back nothing but my own reflection, an old man in a winter coat sitting very still in a lit room. And I thought about all the ways a person can fail the people they raise without ever meaning to. I thought about Derek at 8 years old asking me what every instrument on the panel was for. I thought about Eleanor telling me the last winter she was well enough to sit outside that Derek would find his way eventually. She had believed that. I had tried to. At 11 o'clock, I called Maggie Harlow. Maggie had been my attorney for 14 years. She was 53 sharp in the particular way that comes from paying close attention to things most people wave past, and she had a habit of going very quiet when she was thinking that some people mistook for uncertainty. It was not uncertainty, it was precision. She answered on the third ring. Raymond, it's 11 o'clock. I know what time it is, Maggie. A pause. What happened? I told her everything. I read her the subject line, described the compensation figure, explained what I had understood from the email's language about timeline and demolition. When I finished, she was quiet for long enough that I checked the phone to make sure the call had not dropped. Maggie, I'm here. Her voice had shifted into the register she used when she was building something in her mind. Raymond, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it carefully. Did you touch anything on that laptop other than opening it? No. Did you photograph anything? No. All right. Another pause. I'm going to ask you to do something that is going to feel wrong. I need you to leave that laptop exactly where it is and not mention this conversation to anyone. Not Frank, not your neighbors, not anyone at the airstrip. I understand that part, I said. What I don't understand is why you went quiet for 30 seconds before you said it, she exhaled slowly. Because there's something about that property you need to know, Raymond. Something I should have made sure you fully understood years ago when you signed the maintenance agreement. Her voice was careful now, each word placed like a foot on uncertain ground. The hangar is yours. The land around it is yours. But the runway itself, the lighting system, the approach corridor, the full length of that airstrip that was never transferred to private ownership. It is still under federal jurisdiction. Has been since 1973. I did not say anything. Raymond, I heard you. If Derek proceeds with what that email describes, she said, he will not be destroying private family property. He will be destroying a federally protected aviation facility. That is a different category of crime entirely. Outside, the wind moved through the pine trees at the edge of the yard, and the house made another small sound in its walls, and I sat in Eleanor's chair and looked at my own reflection in the dark window. Then let him proceed, I said. Maggie went quiet again. Then, you're sure? I want him to prove what he is willing to do, Maggie, not what he is planning to do. There is a difference. I stood up from the chair. Start building whatever we need to be ready. I will tell you when. She started to answer, and I could hear in her voice that she had more to say, questions and cautions, and the careful scaffolding of a lawyer who understood exactly how much could go wrong. But she knew me well enough to stop. All right, Raymond, she said. I'll be ready. Maggie's office was on the 4th floor of a building in downtown Billings that smelled like old carpet and radiator heat, the kind of building that had been functional for 40 years, and saw no reason to apologize for it. I drove down 3 days after the phone call. January in Montana means you leave early and you watch the road, and I was sitting across from Maggie's desk by 9 in the morning, with a coffee I did not need and a folder she had already prepared. Before I show you anything, she said, setting both hands flat on the folder, I want to make sure you understand that none of what I am about to tell you changes your ownership of the hangar or the surrounding land. Those are yours, clear title, no dispute. But not the runway, I said. Not the runway. She opened the folder. In 1972, the federal government identified a need for emergency aviation infrastructure in this part of the state. Wildfire response, mountain rescue, backcountry, medical transport, the existing facilities were too far east to be useful when roads closed in winter. They acquired a corridor of land and built the airstrip the following year. Poured the base, installed the lighting system, put in the approach markers. The whole thing. She slid a document across the desk. It was a photocopy of an original survey, the paper yellowed at the edges, stamped in blue ink, with a federal seal I recognized from years of dealing with Forest Service contracts. When I purchased the adjoining property, I said, The attorney at the time told me the airstrip was included. Maggie nodded slowly. He was wrong, or he did not read carefully enough. What was included was the maintenance and operations agreement, which gave you the right to use the runway, maintain it, and coordinate its use for rescue operations on behalf of the federal government. That is a significant right. But it is not ownership. She tapped the document. The title to the runway itself was never transferred. It remained with the Bureau of Land Management. It still does. I looked at the survey document for a long moment. 20 years I had mowed the grass along those approach lights, resurfaced the runway twice with my own equipment, paid for repairs out of my own pocket, because I believed it was mine to care for. It had never occurred to me to question it. "What does that mean for Derek?" I asked. Maggie leaned back in her chair. "It means that when he drives a bulldozer across that runway, he is not committing a civil property dispute. He is committing a federal crime." She picked up a single page from the right side of the folder. Specifically, destruction of federal property under Title 18 of the United States Code, Section 1361. That statute covers willful damage to any property owned by the United States government. The penalty for damage exceeding $1,000 is up to 10 years in federal prison. I let that sit in the room for a moment. "The runway lighting system alone," Maggie continued, "is valued at over $400,000 in the federal maintenance records. The approach corridor infrastructure adds another $200,000. We are not talking about a misdemeanor, Raymond. We are talking about felony destruction of government property minimum." Arthur Pembroke arrived at 10:15, letting himself in with a knock and the particular ease of a man who had been in this office many times before. He was 67, a licensed land surveyor who had worked with federal boundary cases for 3 decades, and he carried a rolled map under one arm like it was a natural extension of his body. He spread it across the conference table without ceremony, smoothing the corners flat with practiced hands. "I pulled the original 1973 survey and the subsequent 1989 boundary confirmation," he said, tracing a red line with his index finger. "This is the federal corridor. It runs the full length of the runway, extends 50 feet on either side, and includes the lighting infrastructure, the drainage system, and the fuel storage access road." He tapped a point near the northern end. "Your hangar sits here 8 feet outside the federal boundary, clear private property. And the runway itself," I said. Arthur looked at me over the top of his glasses. "Government of the United States. Has been since the concrete was poured." I stood up and walked to the window. Below, Billings went about its January morning traffic, moving slowly on the iced streets, a truck idling outside the building across the way, with exhaust rising white into the cold air. "Arthur," I said without turning around, "if someone were to demolish that runway without authorization, tear up the surface, destroy the lighting, take out the drainage, what would the federal government's position be?" Arthur did not hesitate. "They would treat it as a deliberate attack on protected infrastructure, particularly given that this corridor serves active emergency operations. The disruption to rescue response alone would compound the criminal exposure significantly." I turned back from the window. "Then here is what I need from both of you," I said. "I need everything documented and ready. Survey records, title, history, maintenance logs, the full federal classification of the property. I need it organized so that the moment Derek acts, we can place it in front of the right people without losing a single day." Maggie was already writing. "How long do you think we have?" I thought about the email, the timeline it had described, the payment already partially transferred. 3 months, I said. Maybe less. Arthur rolled the map back up with the same deliberate calm he had used to open it. "I'll have the full documentation package ready within the week." Maggie looked up from her notes. "Raymond, there is one more thing. If this goes federal, and it will go federal, you will not be driving this process. You will be a witness and a victim. Are you prepared for that? I picked up my coat from the back of the chair. I have been a witness to the truth my whole life, Maggie, I said. I know how to do that. The week after I met with Maggie and Arthur, she made a phone call I had not asked her to make, but had known she would need to make eventually. She contacted the FBI field office in Billings and reported a credible threat of imminent destruction to a federally classified aviation facility. She told me about it the following morning, matter-of-factly, the way she delivered information she expected me to receive without argument. They took it seriously, she said. An agent is coming out to assess the site. How soon? End of the week. Special Agent Donna Reyes arrived on a Friday afternoon in late January, driving a plain dark sedan that would not have drawn a second glance anywhere in the county. She was 41 years old, compact and deliberate in her movements with the particular quality of attention that I associated with people who had spent years listening to what was not being said as much as what was. She walked the full perimeter of the airstrip before she said a single word to me, stopping at each boundary marker, crouching once to examine the base of the fence where the federal survey stake was still in the ground. When she came back to where I was standing, she pulled out a notebook rather than a phone. "Mr. Cole," she said, "walk me through what you believe is going to happen and when." I told her everything. The email, the compensation figure, the development company, the timeline I had inferred from the language of the agreement. She wrote in her notebook without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking out across the runway. "The cameras on the hangar," she said. "Are they currently operational? 2 of the 4 are. The others need new housings. I want all 4 running within 10 days, she said. Full coverage of the runway surface, the gate, the access road, and the area around the aircraft. Can you arrange that without involving anyone outside of yourself and your attorney?" "Yes." "Good." She closed the notebook. "Mr. Cole, I want to be direct with you about something. If your son proceeds with what you've described, this becomes a federal criminal investigation, and at that point the pace and direction of events will not be in your hands or mine. What I can do between now and then is make sure that when it happens, we capture everything we need to build an airtight case." She looked at me steadily. "That means we do not warn him. We do not confront him. We let it happen." I understand that," I said. "It also means," she said, "that you are going to watch something you care about get destroyed, and you are going to have to stand there and let it happen. That is harder than it sounds." I looked at the Beaver parked inside the open hangar, its restored paint catching the winter light. 9 years of work. The last major project I had taken on after Eleanor died, the thing that had kept my hands busy when keeping them still, would have been unbearable. "Agent Reyes," I said, "I flew combat missions for 20 years. I know the difference between what hurts and what matters." She nodded once. "Then we have an understanding." Over the following weeks, I had all 4 cameras replaced and upgraded. I said nothing to Frank beyond telling him the system was being updated and that he should carry on with normal operations. I met with Maggie twice more, reviewing the documentation package Arthur had assembled, and each time I drove home afterward, I felt the particular stillness of a man who has done everything within his power and must now wait. Derek called once in February. He asked how I was doing in the careful tone people use when they are checking on a situation rather than a person. I told him I was fine. He said he might come up in the spring. I told him the door was always open. He did not come in the spring. He came in April with bulldozers. The morning after Frank's call, after I had sent Maggie the message and finished my coffee, and sat with the weight of what I had just watched happen, Pastor Glenn Whitaker came by the house. Glenn had been my closest friend for 30 years, a tall, unhurried man who had buried half the county and still managed to find something worth saying at every funeral. He sat down at my kitchen table without being asked, poured himself coffee from the pot, and looked at me across the rim of his mug. "Carol Sutton called me this morning," he said. "She saw Derek's video." I had not yet seen it. Glenn turned his phone around and set it on the table between us. Derek had filmed himself standing in front of the destroyed runway, the churned earth and broken fencing visible behind him, speaking directly into the camera with the rehearsed ease of someone who had practiced the words. He said his father had become a danger to himself and the community. He said the airstrip had been operating without proper authorization for years. He said the family had been forced to intervene before someone got hurt. He used the word elderly 3 times in 90 seconds. The video had 4,000 views before noon. I watched it twice. Glenn watched me watch it. When it finished the second time, I set the phone back down on the table and looked out the kitchen window at the mountains. "Raymond," Glenn said carefully, "how are you doing with all of this?" My chest felt the way it does at high altitude, thin, pressurized, each breath a conscious decision. He filmed himself at the site, Glenn, with a timestamp and location services on. Glenn frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said, "that my son just handed a federal agent the exact time and coordinates of a federal crime, posted it publicly, and called it a victory." I picked up my coffee mug. "Bobby used to tell me his father was the smartest man he knew." Glenn was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What do you need from me right now?" "Nothing," I said. "Maggie already started step 2. Maggie called me 2 days after the demolition and told me to come to her office. Her tone was the one she used when she had found something significant and wanted to show it to me in person rather than describe it over the phone. I drove down to Billings the following morning, and when I walked into her office, she had the conference table covered with documents arranged in a precise grid, each one labeled with a small, sticky note in her handwriting. Arthur Pembroke was already there, seated at the far end of the table with a magnifying glass and a set of original survey records spread in front of him. He looked up when I came in and nodded once, which from Arthur constituted a warm greeting. "Sit down, Raymond," Maggie said. "This is going to take a few minutes." I sat. She picked up the first document and held it toward me. "This is the property transfer form Derek filed with the county recorder's office the morning of the demolition. It purports to show that you transferred full ownership of the airstrip property to him on March 15th of this year." She set it down and pointed to a signature line near the bottom. "That is supposed to be your signature." I leaned forward and looked at it. The signature read, "Raymond A. Cole," in a careful, deliberate hand that was close enough to my own to pass a casual inspection. But the A was wrong. My middle initial is not A. It has never been A. My full name is Raymond James Cole, and I have signed it the same way for 50 years. "He got the first name right," I said. "He did," Maggie said without any satisfaction in her voice. "The second document is the demolition authorization." She placed it beside the first. "It carries the seal of the county building department and the signature of the supervising inspector who allegedly approved the permit." She paused. "That inspector's name is Gerald Hobart. Gerald Hobart retired from the county building department in the spring of 2021 and passed away 8 months later. He has been deceased for nearly 3 years." The room was very quiet for a moment. "Someone signed a dead man's name to a demolition permit," I said. "Someone signed a dead man's name to a demolition permit," Maggie confirmed. and filed it with the county as a valid authorization for the destruction of what they believed was private property. She moved to the third document. This is the property map Derek's team used to mark the demolition boundaries. Compare it to this. She placed Arthur's certified federal survey beside it. The difference was not subtle once you knew what to look for. On the official federal map, the runway corridor was marked with a distinct cross-hatched boundary and labeled with a Bureau of Land Management designation code. On Derek's version, that entire section had been replaced with a clean white space. No designation, no boundary marker, no indication that the land was anything other than privately held. Arthur spoke up from his end of the table. Whoever altered this map knew exactly which symbols to remove, he said, tapping the federal version with one finger. They did not simply erase a line. They reconstructed the surrounding area to make the absence look natural. That requires either specialized surveying software or access to someone who knows how to use it. Which means Derek did not do this alone, I said. Almost certainly not, Arthur said. The technical precision involved suggests professional assistance, someone with mapping experience who understood what a legitimate county document should look like. Maggie picked up a fourth sheet. The last item is the most serious. She set it in front of me carefully, the way you set something down when you want the other person to understand its weight before they pick it up. This document is titled Voluntary Waiver of Runway Access Rights. It purports to be a formal agreement in which you voluntarily relinquish all operational rights to the airstrip and consent to its demolition. It is notarized. She pointed to the notary seal in the lower corner. The notary stamp belongs to a firm in Billings. We contacted them this morning. They have no record of ever processing this document. The stamp number does not exist in their system. I picked up the waiver and read it through twice. It described in language that sounded almost like something I might have said my reasons for surrendering the airstrip. Age, reduced capacity, desire to see the land used productively by the next generation. It was written to sound like me, and that particular detail landed somewhere deep and uncomfortable the way it does when someone has studied you carefully enough to imitate you. "She, Maggie," I said, setting the document down. "How many separate felonies are we looking at?" She pulled her notepad from under the edge of the table. Forgery of a property transfer instrument. Forgery of a government permit. Fraudulent use of a deceased official's signature and credentials. Alteration of a federal boundary document. Creation of a false notarial record. She looked up. And those are only the document-related charges. We have not yet counted the destruction of federal property, the conspiracy charges, or the wire fraud exposure from the electronic communications with the development company. Arthur set down his magnifying glass. Raymond, whoever put this package together, was confident they would never be examined closely. Each individual document might survive a quick review. Together they fall apart within an hour. I looked at the grid of false documents spread across Maggie's conference table and thought about the 11-year-old boy who had once asked me, standing at the edge of the runway on a cold afternoon, whether telling the truth was always worth it when lying was easier. I had told him yes. I had believed he understood me. "What happens next?" I asked. Maggie capped her pen. "I send everything to Agent Reyes today. From this point forward, this is a federal criminal investigation." She looked at me steadily. Raymond Derek did not just make a mistake. He built a case against himself and handed it to us one document at a time. I stood up, buttoned my coat, and looked at the table one last time. "Then let us make sure," I said, "that not a single page of it gets lost." Maggie called on a Tuesday morning in early May, and I could tell from the first words she said that whatever she had found was not going to be simple. Raymond, I need you to look at something before I send it to Agent Reyes. A pause. I found the name of the lead investor in Derek's development agreement. All right, I said. Who is it? She said the name and I sat down. Conrad Webb and I had met in the spring of 1984 at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. Two young Army pilots assigned to the same transport unit, who discovered within 48 hours of meeting each other that they shared an unusual combination of traits, a serious approach to flying, and a complete inability to take anything else seriously. We had served together for 6 years, attended each other's weddings, driven combined distances of several thousand miles, to be present at funerals and graduations, and the kinds of ordinary occasions that only matter because someone you care about is at the center of them. When Conrad left the Army and moved to Billings to build a property development business, we had lunch every few months and talked the way old friends talk in shorthand, without having to explain the references. I had not spoken to him in 4 months. I had assumed he was busy. Does he know? I asked Maggie. I don't believe so, she said. The contract documents Derek sent him used the altered property map and the forged title records. From Conrad's perspective, he was purchasing a legitimately available parcel from a willing seller. There is no indication in the communication trail that he had any knowledge of the fraud. He would have had his own attorneys review it, I said. He did. Derek's forged documents were thorough enough to pass that review. His lawyers saw what appeared to be a clean title and a signed transfer agreement. They had no reason to look deeper. Her voice was careful. Raymond Conrad is a victim in this. But I need you to understand that his name is going to appear prominently in the federal investigation, and if we do not get ahead of that, it could damage a 40-year friendship in a way that has nothing to do with either of you. I told her I would handle it myself. I called Conrad that afternoon and asked if he could meet me for lunch. He suggested a diner outside of town that we had been going to since the 90s, a place with good coffee and booths wide enough that you could spread papers across the table without the person next to you being able to read them. He was there when I arrived, already on his second cup, wearing the kind of expression that told me he had been expecting a different kind of conversation than the one we were about to have. We talked for a few minutes about nothing important, the way you do when you are buying time to find the right way into something difficult. Then I reached into the folder I had brought and placed the certified federal survey map on the table between us. Conrad looked at it. His eyebrows came together slowly. That is the Airstrip property, he said. It is, I said. Look at the boundary line along the runway corridor. He leaned forward, and I watched his face as he read the federal designation codes that Arthur had pointed out to me 3 months earlier. The color left his face in a way I had not seen since the morning in '89, when we got the news about a pilot from our unit who had not come back from a training exercise. Raymond, he said. His voice had dropped to something very quiet. The contract I signed was built on documents that did not accurately represent this property, I said. The title records Derek sent you were altered. The transfer agreement carried my signature, but I did not sign it. My middle initial is wrong on every page. Conrad set both hands flat on the table. His jaw was tight, the muscles working under the skin. I had my attorneys go through everything, he said. They said it was clean. They were looking at convincing forgeries, I said. Arthur Pembroke found the alterations within an hour, but he knew exactly what to look for. Your attorneys had no reason to suspect the underlying documents had been tampered with. Conrad was quiet for a long moment. Outside the diner window, a truck pulled through the gravel lot and parked, and a man got out and stretched his back in the May sunlight, and the ordinary morning went on completely indifferent to what was happening at our table. He told me, Conrad said finally, his voice rough at the edges, that you were ready to move on. that the airstrip had become too much to manage at your age, that you had discussed it with him and the family was in agreement. He looked up at me, and there was something in his eyes that was beyond embarrassment, something older and more painful. Raymond, I asked him directly whether you were certain. He said you were relieved. My chest tightened in the particular way it does when grief and anger arrive at the same moment, and you cannot afford to let either one take over. Conrad, I said, I need you to give me everything. Every email, every document, every communication you received from Derek or anyone associated with his company. I need it for the federal investigation. He did not hesitate. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed a flash drive on the table between us. I pulled it last night, he said. After you called, I had a feeling. He pushed the drive toward me with one finger. There is an email in there from 3 weeks before the demolition. Derek wrote that once the old man was out of the picture, the land would be clean and the project could move forward on schedule. He paused. I did not understand what out of the picture meant when I read it. I think I understand it now. I picked up the flash drive and held it for a moment. Conrad, I said, this is not on you. He shook his head slowly, staring at the table. I should have called you Raymond. Before I signed anything, I should have picked up the phone and called you directly, and I did not, and I have been sitting with that since last night. His voice cracked at the last word, just slightly the way a man's voice does when he is holding something together through effort rather than ease. I reached across the table and gripped his forearm, once the way we used to grip each other after hard landings, the silent acknowledgement between pilots that the ground had been reached, and the worst was behind them. You can make it right, I said. You already started. Conrad's flash drive gave Agent Reyes enough to expand the investigation, and the first thing she expanded it into was money. She brought in a forensic accountant named Diane Kowalski, who worked financial crime cases out of the Billings field office, and had the particular gift of being able to explain complicated financial structures to non-accountants without making them feel condescended to. Maggie arranged for me to sit in on the presentation, which happened on a Thursday afternoon in late May, in a conference room at the Federal Building downtown, the kind of room with no windows and fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look like they have not slept in several days. Diane was 46 precise in the way that people who work with numbers all day tend to become precise about everything, and she had printed her findings on paper rather than presenting them on a screen, which I respected. She set a single page in front of me and let me read it before she said anything. The number at the top was $780,000. Walk me through it, I said. She pulled her chair closer to the table. 6 weeks before the demolition, a company called Ridgeline Property Partners transferred $300,000 to a limited liability company registered in Delaware called Summit Advisory Group. Summit Advisory Group has one registered member, Derek J. Cole. She tapped the page. 3 weeks later, a second transfer of $240,000 moved through an intermediary account in Nevada before landing in the same Delaware LLC. The final payment of $240,000 was scheduled for 30 days after confirmation of completed demolition. He had not received the full amount yet, I said. She correct. The final payment was contingent on delivery of a clear, unencumbered title to the development parcel, which, as of the morning the bulldozers arrived, he believed he was approximately 48 hours away from securing. She set a second page beside the first. The total compensation package was $780,000 paid personally to Derek through a shell company structured specifically to obscure the connection between the payment and the underlying transaction. Maggie leaned forward from the chair beside me. Diane explained the shell company structure for Raymond in plain terms. Diane nodded. A shell company is a legally registered business entity that exists on paper, but conducts no actual business activity. People use them for legitimate purposes sometimes. But in this context, Derek created Summit Advisory Group for one reason only: to receive money in a way that would not be immediately traceable back to him personally. By routing the payments through Delaware and then through a Nevada intermediary account, he created what investigators call layering. Each transfer looks on its own like a normal business transaction. It is only when you map the complete chain that the destination becomes clear. Now, how did you find it? I asked. Conrad Webb's attorneys had requested documentation of the full payment structure as part of their due diligence, she said. That documentation was in the files on the flash drive Conrad provided. Once I had the name Summit Advisory Group, the Delaware registration records were public. She allowed herself a small, satisfied expression. Derek created the shell company 11 months ago, 4 months before you found the email on his laptop. That particular detail settled into the room with some weight. 11 months ago, Derek had been building the financial architecture of this plan while sitting across Thanksgiving dinner tables and asking how I was feeling and whether I needed anything. The planning had not been impulsive. It had been patient and deliberate, the kind of patience that takes effort to maintain when you are looking someone in the face every few weeks and keeping it hidden. What happens to the money? I asked. Maggie answered that one. Under federal civil asset forfeiture statutes specifically, Title 18, Section 981 of the United States Code, any proceeds derived from a federal crime are subject to government seizure. The 2 payments Derek already received, totaling $540,000, can be frozen immediately upon the filing of a forfeiture action. The 3rd payment, which has not yet been transferred, will never clear once the development company understands the full legal exposure they are facing. Which means Derek receives nothing, I said. Which means Derek receives nothing. Maggie confirmed. And faces personal liability for restitution on top of the criminal charges. Diane placed a 3rd page on the table. It was a timeline, the kind of visual document that lawyers used to show juries how events connect to each other, with dates and amounts and entity names arranged in a clear horizontal sequence. At the far right end of the timeline, the 3rd payment sat in a box marked Contingent Undelivered. There is one more item, Diane said. The morning after the demolition, Derek attempted to transfer $80,000 from the Summit Advisory Group account to a personal account held jointly with his wife. She looked at me carefully. The transfer was flagged by the receiving bank as unusual activity and held for review. It has not yet cleared. The room was very quiet for a moment. Outside in the hallway, I could hear footsteps passing and the distant sound of a door closing, the ordinary sounds of a building full of people doing their ordinary work. He tried to move the morning after, I said. 8:47 in the morning, Diane said. Approximately 4 hours after the demolition was completed. I thought about Derek standing on the ruins of the runway at 8:47 in the morning, convinced he had won, transferring money between accounts on his phone, while the concrete dust was still settling. I thought about the 11-year-old boy asking me whether the truth was always worth it. I looked at Diane. Can I ask you something that is not strictly about the numbers? Of course, she said. In your experience, I said, do people who build these kinds of structures, the shell companies, the layered transfers, the careful timing, do they ever believe they are going to get caught? Diane considered that for a moment, with the same precision she brought to everything else. No, she said. They never do. That is usually the most expensive mistake they make. Maggie called me on a Monday morning in early June and said 4 words that I had not expected to hear. Vanessa came to me. I was standing in the kitchen, the same kitchen where Frank's call had reached me 6 weeks earlier, and I set down the dish I was holding carefully, the way you handle things when your hands understand. Before your mind does, that the next few minutes are going to require your full attention. When? I asked. Friday afternoon. She drove down from Billings alone. She did not tell Derek she was coming. Maggie's voice was measured the way it gets when she is organizing a large amount of information into the sequence that will be most useful. Raymond, I need to tell you something about Vanessa that changes the shape of what we have been looking at. Tell me. She has been recording Derek since last October. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, a meadowlark was working through its morning repertoire on the fence post nearest the window. The same fence post it had claimed every June for the past 4 years, indifferent to everything happening below it. Recording him how? I asked. A small device she kept in her bag. She activated it whenever they were alone in the house and Derek was in a talking mood. Maggie paused. She started doing it because she suspected he was being dishonest with her about money. There were transfers she could not account for, evenings he claimed to be working late that did not line up with his actual schedule. She wanted documentation in case the marriage reached a point where she needed to protect herself. She was building a case for divorce, I said. That was her intention, yes. But what she captured over 8 months of recordings was not what she was looking for. Another pause, longer this time. Raymond, the recordings contain 37 separate conversations in which Derek discusses the Airstrip. The plan to acquire it, the timeline, the payments, the shell company, the forged documents. In his own voice, in his own words, in his own kitchen. I pulled a chair out from the table and sat down. Montana, Maggie continued, operates under what is called a one-party consent recording law. Under Montana Code, annotated section 45-8-213, a person may legally record any conversation in which they are a participant without notifying the other parties. Vanessa was present for every conversation she recorded. What does Derek say on them? I asked. Specifically, I heard Maggie set something down on her desk. There is one conversation from February 2 months before the demolition, in which Derek says, and I am reading directly from the transcript. Now the old man signed the paperwork, whether he knows it or not. We move in April, we have it done in a day, and by the time anyone figures out the title is clean, the money is already gone. She stopped. He uses your name 4 times in that conversation, Raymond. He discusses the federal survey documents specifically and states that removing the boundary markers before demolition begins will eliminate any physical record of the classification. My right hand was resting on the kitchen table, and I noticed that it was pressing down against the wood harder than it needed to, the way your body finds somewhere to put the weight of something when there is no other place for it to go. Why did she come to you now? I asked. She has had these recordings for months. She did not understand what she had. Maggie said, she knew Derek was doing something with your property. She did not understand the federal dimension until Bobby explained it to her. He read the initial news coverage of the investigation and called her the same night. There was something careful in Maggie's voice now. She also told me something else. She said that the week before the demolition, Derek told her he was handling a family property matter and that she should not ask questions about it. She said she did not ask. She is living with that. I looked out the kitchen window at the meadowlark still working through its song on the fence post, patient and unhurried. Is she all right? I asked. Maggie was quiet for a moment, in the particular way she goes quiet when a question has surprised her. She is frightened, she said finally. She has a 19-year-old son and a marriage that is ending and a husband who is about to be indicted by a federal grand jury. but she walked into my office alone on a Friday afternoon and handed me 8 months of recordings without asking for anything in return. A pause. I think she is more all right than she knows. What does she need from this process? I asked. She needs to know that cooperating fully will be taken into account, Maggie said. And she asked me one question before she left. She wanted to know whether you were angry with her. I thought about that for a moment. Vanessa had married my son 14 years ago at a small ceremony in the mountains outside Denver, and Eleanor had cried through the entire reception, which Eleanor only did when she was genuinely happy. Vanessa had not made Derek into what he was. She had simply been married to him long enough to see it clearly, and when the moment came, she had walked into a lawyer's office alone with 8 months of recordings and handed them over without being asked. Tell her no, I said. Tell her I am not angry with her at all. Maggie exhaled slowly. I thought that was what you would say. Maggie, I said. How strong is the case now? She did not answer immediately, and Maggie Harlow was not a woman who hesitated when she knew the answer to something. Raymond, she said, with the recordings, the financial documentation, the survey records, the forged documents, and Conrad's files, there is not a version of events in which Derek does not face serious federal charges. The only remaining question is how many people stand beside him when he does. She paused one final time. Bobby called me this morning as well. He said there is something in the video metadata he wants to show us. Bobby drove down from Missoula on a Wednesday. He had called the night before briefly to say he was coming, and that he had something to show me in person rather than over the phone. He arrived at my house at 9 in the morning in a car that had seen better years with a laptop bag over one shoulder, and the particular look young people get when they are carrying something they believe matters and are not yet sure how it will be received. He was 19 years old and had his mother's eyes and his grandfather's chin, or so Eleanor used to say. And standing on my porch that morning, he looked younger than 19 and considerably older than 19 at the same time, which is the thing that happens to people when difficult circumstances arrive before they have finished becoming who they are going to be. Grandpa, he said. Bobby. I stepped back and held the door open. Come in. There's coffee. He sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around his mug and did not say anything for a moment. Looking at the table surface the way people look at things when they are organizing their thoughts into the right order. I waited. I had learned a long time ago that some conversations need a runway before they can take off. I want to say something first, he said, before I show you the technical stuff. All right, he looked up. His jaw was set in a way that reminded me unexpectedly and painfully of Derek at the same age. I didn't know what he was planning. I want you to know that. I knew things weren't right between him and you, but I didn't know about any of this until I read the news coverage. And when I did, he stopped, pressed his lips together, started again. I called Mom that same night. I told her she had to go talk to the lawyer. I told her what she had on her recorder was important, even if she didn't understand why yet. Suiko, I know, I said. Maggie told me. Are you... He stopped again. The hands around the mug tightened slightly. Are you okay, Grandpa? I mean actually okay. Not the version you tell people when you don't want them to worry. The question landed somewhere I was not entirely prepared for. 19 years old, and already he understood the difference between those two answers. Not entirely, I said. But I'm working on it. Show me what you found. He pulled the laptop from his bag and opened it on the table between us, turning the screen so we could both see it. On the left side was a still image captured from Derek's social media video, the one he had posted the morning of the demolition, standing in front of the destroyed runway with the churned earth behind him. On the right side was a data table filled with text and numbers that meant nothing to me at first glance. "This is called XIF data," Bobby said, pointing to the right side of the screen. "It stands for Exchangeable Image File Format. Every photo and video taken on a smartphone automatically embeds a packet of information into the file itself: the date, the time, the device model, and if location services are enabled on the phone, the precise GPS coordinates of where the file was created." He tapped the screen. Dad's location services were on. "What does that mean in practical terms?" I asked. "It means this video is not just a video," Bobby said. "It is a time-stamped, GPS-verified record of my father standing at those specific coordinates at that specific time." He pointed to a line in the data table. "This coordinate places him at the airstrip. This timestamp puts him there at 7:14 in the morning. The demolition crew's own work records show they began at 6:45. He looked at me. "The video he posted publicly to tell everyone he had won is also a piece of federal evidence that places him at the scene of a federal crime at the exact time it was being committed." I looked at the data table for a long moment. Columns of numbers that Derek had never thought to consider embedded automatically in a file he had posted himself because he was proud of what he had done and wanted people to see it. "He didn't know the metadata was there," I said. Most people don't think about it," Bobby said. "The video looks like just a video. You have to know to look for the underlying data." He reached into his bag and produced a printed report, several pages stapled together. I put together a full analysis. GPS coordinates timestamp cross-referenced against the demolition crew's scheduled device identification, matching the phone registered to Derek J. Cole, and a chain of custody document showing I did not alter any of the source files. He slid it across the table. "I talked to a professor in my department. He said it would hold up." I picked up the report and held it. My grandson had driven 3 hours from Missoula, sat at my kitchen table, asked me whether I was actually all right, and handed me a forensic document he had built himself because he understood that the truth needed to be preserved in a form that courts could use. "Bobby," I said, "this is good work." Something moved across his face that was not quite a smile and not quite tears, and was probably some honest combination of the two. "I have Maggie's number," he said. "I can take it to her directly if that's easier." "We'll go together," I said. He nodded both hands back around the mug. We sat for a few minutes without talking, which was different from silence, because it was comfortable rather than empty. The particular quality of quiet that exists between people who have just said the things that needed saying and do not need to fill the space afterward with anything extra. Outside, the morning was moving through its ordinary business. The same mountains, the same sky, the same fence post where the meadowlark would return in an hour. I refilled both our mugs. "Your grandmother would have liked you very much," I said. "She always said the best kind of smart was the kind that knew what to do with itself." Bobby looked at his coffee. "What was she like?" "Honest," I said. "In the way that made everything around her more honest just by being near it." I picked up my mug. "You have some of that? More than you know?" He did not answer, but his shoulders settled in a way that told me the words had reached the place they were meant to reach. We drove to Maggie's office an hour later. Agent Reyes was already there. Before I reveal the devastating footage that completely unmasked his entire scheme, drop a comment saying, "Still here," or type the number 100 below, so I know you're still watching with me. And please note, the following chapters contain some fictionalized details added for dramatic effect, which may not be completely factual if that isn't what you are looking for today. You can go ahead and turn off the video right here. Agent Reyes was standing at the window when Bobby and I walked into Maggie's conference room. She turned when we came in, glanced at Bobby with the brief, assessing look she gave everyone she had not met before, and then looked at me. Russell Greer contacted the field office yesterday morning, she said without preamble. He asked to speak with whoever was leading the investigation into the airstrip demolition. He said he had video footage and that he believed he had been misled about the nature of the work he was hired to perform. I pulled out a chair and sat down. Bobby sat beside me, his laptop bag on the floor between his feet. "Where is he now?" I asked. "Waiting downstairs," Agent Reyes said. "I wanted to speak with you first. What I'm about to show you in this room, I will also be showing him, and I want you to understand what is on the footage before we bring him up." She set a tablet on the table and turned it to face me. His crew ran a camera on the lead bulldozer throughout the demolition. Standard practice for liability documentation. He pulled the footage after reading the coverage of the federal investigation and spent 2 days deciding what to do with it. She pressed play. The footage was shot from a wide-angle camera mounted above the bulldozer's cab, looking forward across the blade. The timestamp in the lower corner read April 6:47 in the morning. The quality was good enough to see faces clearly in the early light. Derek appeared in the frame within the first 30 seconds, walking alongside the machine as it moved toward the runway surface, gesturing with one hand at the approach lighting system running along the left edge of the strip. His voice came through the audio clearly, slightly compressed by the camera's microphone, but entirely intelligible. "Start with the lights," he said. "Work from the north end down. I want the surface broken up before anyone drives past on the county road." The bulldozer operator's voice came back through the speaker, asking about the markings along the runway edge metal posts, with reflective bands that he had not seen on a private airstrip before. Derek walked to the nearest post, gripped it with both hands, and pulled it free of the ground with one sharp motion. He held it up, read the inscription stamped into the metal, and dropped it in the mud without changing his expression. "Take them all out before you start the pass," he said. "If there's no marker, there's nothing to photograph." Agent Reyes paused the footage. The room held the particular quality of stillness that follows something significant, the way air feels in the seconds after a door slams somewhere far away. "He read it," I said. "He read it aloud," Agent Reyes said. "The audio captures the full text of the federal designation stamp. He knew what those markers indicated before the first blade hit the runway surface." She set the tablet down. "That converts every subsequent action from a potentially reckless mistake into deliberate, premeditated destruction of federal property. The legal distinction is significant. It affects sentencing guidelines, the severity of charges, and the degree of criminal intent the prosecution can establish before a jury." Bobby had been watching the tablet screen since Agent Reyes pressed play, his forearms resting on the table, his face very still. "He knew the whole time," he said. It was not quite a question. "From the moment he pulled that marker out of the ground." Agent Reyes said yes. She let that sit for a moment, then looked at me. "Russell Greer, in my assessment, is not a bad man. He is a man who accepted a job based on documentation he believed was legitimate, carried it out, and then spent several weeks being unable to sleep before he picked up the phone." She folded her hands on the table. "His cooperation is voluntary. He is not receiving any guarantee of immunity at this stage. He is here because he decided it was the right thing to do, which in my experience is rarer than it should be." "Bring him up," I said. Russell Greer was a large man, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of hands that come from decades of physical work. and the kind of face that does not hide what it is carrying particularly well. He came into the conference room and stopped when he saw me, and something moved across his face that was not comfortable to look at and was not meant to be. "Mr. Cole," he said. His voice was rough at the edges, the way voices get when a man has been thinking about what he is going to say for too long. "I need you to know that when Derek came to me, he told me you had signed everything over willingly. He told me you were ready to be done with the property, and that the family had all agreed. He showed me the transfer documents and the demolition permit, and I—" He stopped, pressed one large hand against the back of his neck. "I should have called the number on those federal markers before I let my crew anywhere near them. I know that. I have known that since the first morning." I looked at him across the table. He was not asking me to forgive him. He was stating what he had done and what he understood about it, which is a different thing and a harder one. "You called Agent Reyes," I said. "You drove down here. You handed over the footage. It didn't feel like enough," he said. "It rarely does," I said. "But it is what was needed, and you did it." Russell set a hard drive on the table, the original unedited footage from the bulldozer camera chain of custody documentation, attached every file time-stamped and verified. Agent Reyes picked it up and turned it over once in her hands. "Mr. Greer," she said, "I have one question for the record. At any point during the demolition, did Derek Cole instruct you or your crew to specifically target the aircraft in the hangar?" Russell's jaw tightened. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed a second drive beside the first. "There is a separate file," he said quietly. 11 minutes into the operation. You will want to see it before you ask me that question again." Agent Reyes looked at the drive. Then she looked at me. "Raymond," she said, "I think you should step out for this one." I shook my head. "Play it." I watched the second file alone. Agent Reyes cleared the room without explanation, and I sat in Maggie's conference room with the tablet in front of me, and 11 minutes of footage that showed my son pointing at the de Havilland Beaver and telling Russell Greer's crew to push it clear of the hangar and run the blade across it until there was nothing left worth coming back for. I watched it once. Then I turned the tablet face down on the table and sat with my hands folded in my lap for a while, looking at the wall. When Agent Reyes came back in, she asked me if I was all right. I told her I needed to speak with Derek before she moved forward with the arrest. She studied me for a moment with the careful attention she brought to everything, then said she could give me until the following morning. I drove to Derek's house that evening alone. No lawyer, no recordings, no agenda beyond the conversation itself. He answered the door in the clothes he had been wearing all day, a coffee mug in one hand, and when he saw me, his expression moved through several things quickly, before settling on the careful neutrality he had been using around me for months. He stepped back to let me in without saying anything, which I took as an invitation. His house was large and well-appointed, in the way that things are when someone has spent money to signal a version of themselves rather than to build a home. The furniture was expensive and impersonal. The walls held art that matched rather than art that meant something. Eleanor would have walked through this room and been saddened by it, and she would not have said so, and I would have known anyway. Derek set his mug on the kitchen counter and turned to face me. "Dad." His voice was controlled. "This is unexpected." "I know," I said. "I won't stay long." I reached into the inside pocket of my jacket and placed 2 photographs on the kitchen counter between us. The first was from his parents' wedding, Eleanor in the dress she had borrowed from her college roommate, because they could not afford to buy one, laughing at something off camera, her whole face lit from the inside with the particular joy of someone who does not yet know how much they are going to need the memory of that moment. The second was Derek at 8 years old, standing on the top rail of the airstrip fence with both arms out for balance, squinting into the sun, the Beaver visible in the background, with its engine cowling open. Derek looked at the photographs. A muscle moved in his jaw. "I am not here to threaten you," I said. "I am not here to tell you what is coming, because I think you already know. I came because there is one thing I needed to say to you in person, without anyone else in the room." He looked up from the photographs. His eyes were careful and tired in equal measure. "Your mother loved you in a way that did not ask anything from you," I said. "She loved you the way good people love, without a ledger, without conditions, without keeping track of what she was owed in return. She drove 6 hours through a January snowstorm to watch you give a 15-minute presentation at a trade conference because you mentioned it once at dinner, and she wrote it in her calendar." My voice stayed level. I had decided before I came that it would stay level. She would have loved you through this too. That is not a comfort. I know that. I am telling you because I think you have spent a long time believing that love is something people use to get things from each other. And I want you to understand, from the one person who cannot possibly benefit from telling you otherwise, that you were wrong about that. Derek's hand moved to the counter and gripped the edge of it. His knuckles went pale. "Dad!" "I am not finished," I said quietly. He stopped. "I am not angry with you," I said. "I want to be clear about that because I think you are expecting anger. And I think in some way, you would find it easier than what I am actually feeling." I picked up the photograph of Eleanor and held it for a moment before putting it back in my pocket. "What I feel is grief. For the boy in that photograph. For the person you chose not to become. For the years your mother spent believing you would find your way to something better than this." I picked up the second photograph, Derek at 8 arms out balancing on the fence rail, and placed it on the counter in front of him. "Keep that one." He looked down at the photograph. The muscle in his jaw was working steadily now, and his shoulders had the rigid quality of someone using a considerable amount of effort to hold themselves in a particular position. "Derek," I said, "I have one question, that is all." He did not answer, but he did not look away. "The morning you drove to that airstrip," I said, "when you were standing there watching it come apart, was there a single moment when you thought about calling me? Not to stop, not to ask permission, just to tell me what you were doing and why one person to another, the way your grandfather taught me a man is supposed to conduct himself?" The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something Derek was not going to say, and we both knew it. And there was nothing left to do with that knowledge except carry it. His voice when it came was lower than I had heard it in years. "You should go, Dad." I picked up my coat from the back of the chair where I had laid it. "The photograph is yours," I said. "Whatever happens next, that boy on the fence was real. Nobody can take that away from either of us." I walked to the front door and let myself out. Behind me, I heard Derek's hand hit the counter once hard, the sound of someone reaching the end of something they had been holding together for a long time. I did not turn back. Agent Reyes called at 7 the following morning. Agent Reyes called at 7 in the morning and said 4 words. "We are moving today." I told her I understood. She told me to stay away from Derek's address and to keep my phone on. I told her I would be at the church. She paused for a moment, as if she was going to say something else, and then decided against it and ended the call. I drove to Pastor Glenn Whitaker's church on the south side of Billings before 8, the roads still quiet in the early morning light, the mountains sitting where they always sat above the city, indifferent and patient. Glenn was unlocking the side door when I pulled into the lot, and he took one look at my face and said nothing about the fact that I had shown up unannounced at 7:15 on a Thursday morning. He just held the door open and let me in. We sat in the front pew. The church was empty and cool, the morning light coming through the east windows in long, dusty columns that fell across the wooden floor and the backs of the empty seats. Glenn had been a pastor for 31 years, and he had the quality that the best ones develop over time. The ability to be present without filling the space with himself. "Derek," he said after a while. "They are picking him up this morning," I said. Glenn folded his hands on his knee and looked at the altar. "How are you carrying it?" "With difficulty," I said. "But I am carrying it." We sat together for a while without talking, which was different from what it had been in the conference room with Bobby, because this silence was older and had more weight to it. The particular quality of quiet that exists in spaces where people have brought their hardest things for a long time. My phone rang at 8:43. It was Bobby. I answered on the first ring. "Grandpa." His voice was tight, the words coming out controlled and deliberate the way they do when a young person is working very hard not to come apart. "They just left. I came to the house this morning to talk to Mom, and I was still there when Agent Reyes arrived. There were 2 other agents with her." A breath. He didn't say anything when they read him his rights. He just stood there in the kitchen looking at the floor. Mom was at the table and she didn't move. Nobody moved for a long time. "Bobby-chan," I said, "are you with your mother right now?" "Yes, sir, she is okay. She is sitting at the kitchen table and she is okay." His voice thinned slightly at the edges. "Grandpa," he looked at me when they walked him out. Right before they got to the door, he turned and looked at me, and I didn't know what to do with that. I didn't know what my face was supposed to do. My chest tightened in the way it had been tightening repeatedly for weeks. The same pressure. At the same point, grief and love and anger arriving together in a combination that had no clean resolution. "You didn't have to do anything with it," I said. "You just had to be there. And you were." "He looked older," Bobby said quietly. "I don't know why I keep thinking about that. He just looked older than I remembered." "Bobby," I said, "stay with your mother today. Don't watch the news. Call me tonight." "Yes, sir." A pause. "Are you okay?" "I am in a church with Pastor Glenn," I said. "I am as okay as the situation allows." He made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost something else, the complicated sound of a 19-year-old trying to hold several things at once that were not meant to be held simultaneously. "Okay," he said. "I'll call tonight." I put the phone in my pocket and looked at the light coming through the east windows. Glenn had been listening without appearing to listen the way pastors do. "The boy Wandita," he said. "He is going to be all right," I said. "He is built for more than this." Glenn was quiet for a moment. Then, "Raymond, can I ask you something?" "You can ask me anything, Glenn. You always have. When you went to see Derek last night." He chose his words with the care he brought to everything that mattered. "Did you say what you needed to say? Not for him. For yourself?" I thought about Eleanor's photograph in my inside pocket. I thought about the sound Derek's hand made against the counter. I thought about the drive back from his house the night before, and the sound his hand had made against the counter, and the way he had not turned around when I walked out the door. I thought about Bobby on the phone saying he looked older. I thought about how much older we had all become since January, and whether any of it had been necessary, and I already knew the answer to that. "Yes," I said. I said what needed to be said. Glenn nodded slowly. He reached over and gripped my forearm, once the same gesture I had used with Conrad Webb in the diner. the same wordless acknowledgement that the ground had been reached. "Carol Sutton called me this morning," he said then. "Before you arrived. She said she is writing something, and she wants to speak with you." I had forgotten about Carol. In the weeks since Derek had posted his video and tagged her publication, she had been quiet in the way that journalists sometimes go quiet when they are reconsidering the story they thought they were writing. "What did she say?" I asked. Glenn almost smiled. "She said the first article she wrote got the story exactly backward and that she intends to spend however long it takes getting it exactly right." He looked at me. She sounded like someone who had made a decision and was at peace with the cost of it. I looked at the light on the empty pews and thought about the way truth moves through the world, not loudly, not quickly, but with a patience that outlasts everything that tries to stand in front of it. "Tell her I will talk to her," I said. "Tell her to come to Montana." Carol Sutton drove up from Billings on a Friday morning in late June, alone in a car with a press pass hanging from the rearview mirror and a recorder she asked my permission to use before she took it out of her bag. That last detail mattered to me more than she probably knew. She was 34 years old, with the particular alertness of someone who had trained herself to notice things other people walked past, and she sat across from me at my kitchen table with a notepad open and a coffee she had barely touched, and looked at me the way people look at someone when they are trying to understand how a story they thought they knew turned out to be a different story entirely. "I want to start by telling you something," she said, "before I ask you anything." "All right, why son," I said. 3 weeks before the demolition, Derek contacted my editor." Her voice was steady and deliberate, each word placed with care. "He offered the paper an exclusive on what he called a community improvement story, a private airstrip being converted to residential and recreational use, a family working together to modernize aging property, positive development for the valley." My editor assigned it to me. She looked down at her notepad, then back up. "Derek took me to lunch and spent 2 hours explaining his version of events. He was persuasive and specific, and he had documents that looked legitimate and a narrative that fit the kind of story readers respond to." She paused. "I wrote what he told me without calling you, without verifying the property records, without asking a single question he had not already answered for me." "I know," I said. "I read the article. Then you know it was wrong in almost every particular that mattered." She did not look away when she said it, which I respected. "The second article I am writing will be different, but I did not come here to ask you to help me fix my reputation. I came because the full story has not been told publicly yet, and the people in this valley who were manipulated by Derek's version of events deserve to understand what actually happened and why." She set her pen down on the notepad. "Mr. Cole, will you tell me the true version from the beginning in your own words without leaving anything out?" I looked at her for a moment. Outside the kitchen window, the afternoon light was moving across the field the way it does in June in Montana, slow and golden and indifferent to everything below it. "Call me Raymond," I said. And yes. We talked for 4 hours. I told her everything. The email on Derek's laptop, the call to Maggie, the meeting with Arthur Pembroke, and the federal survey documents, the 3 months of waiting the morning Frank called, and what I said, and what I sent to Maggie afterward. I told her about Agent Reyes walking the perimeter in January, and the cameras going up, and the particular discipline of watching a plan unfold that you have already accounted for. I told her about Conrad Webb sitting across from me in the diner with the color gone from his face. I told her about Diane Kowalski's timeline and the shell company and the $80,000 Derek tried to move the morning after. I told her about Bobby driving 3 hours from Missoula with a forensic metadata report in his laptop bag and asking me whether I was actually all right. Carol wrote steadily through all of it. her pen moving across the notepad in the shorthand journalists develop after years of needing to capture more than they can type. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, turning back through her notes. "Raymond," she said, "I want to ask you something that is not strictly about the facts of the case." "Ask it." "Derek's video is still up," she said. "It has been viewed over 40,000 times now. There are people in this community who saw it before any of the investigation became public, and who formed an opinion of you based entirely on what he said in it." She looked at me carefully. "Did that cost you anything, personally, beyond the legal situation?" I thought about that honestly before I answered. "There were people at the hardware store who did not meet my eyes for a few weeks," I said. "A neighbor who had been friendly for 15 years stopped waving when I drove past. One morning, someone left a note in my mailbox that said things I will not repeat." I picked up my coffee mug. It cost me something, yes. But I knew it would, and I knew it would not last, because the truth was already in motion, and the only thing required of me was to let it arrive at its own pace. Carol looked at me for a long moment. "How do you do that?" she said. "How do you watch someone damage you publicly and simply wait?" "You learn it the same way you learn anything," I said. "By needing it badly enough for long that it becomes part of how you operate." She wrote something in her notepad. Then she looked up. "Last question. When this is over, the trial, the sentence, all of it, what do you want for Derek?" The question sat in the kitchen between us, and I gave it the time it deserved. "I want him to understand what he did," I said, finally. "Not what the law says he did. What he actually did to himself, to his son, to the people who trusted him. The legal consequences will happen regardless of what I want. What I am hoping for is something the law cannot mandate." I set the mug down. "I am hoping that somewhere in the middle of all of this, he finds his way back to the person he was on that fence rail when he was 8 years old. The one who still believed that understanding how things worked was more important than owning them." Carol did not write that down. She just looked at me for a moment, and then she nodded once slowly, the way people nod when something has landed in a place they were not expecting. She published the article 11 days later. The headline read, "The Airstrip He Never Owned and the Father Who Waited." By the end of the first week, Frank Dalton called to tell me that the neighbor who had stopped waving had knocked on his own door and asked for my number. Frank called on a Tuesday morning in early July and said he had something at the Airstrip he needed me to see in person. He did not say what it was. Frank Dalton was not a man who explained things over the phone when he believed they needed to be seen directly, and in 20 years of working together, I had learned that when he used that particular tone, quiet, careful, slightly removed from his usual directness, the thing he had found was worth the drive. I arrived at the Airstrip at 9. The main gate was open, the gravel access road rutted from the equipment that had come and gone since April. The tree line along the eastern boundary looking stripped and wrong without the pines, Derek's crew had trimmed back to improve sight lines for the demolition equipment. The runway was still torn up, ridges of broken earth running its full length, the lighting system gone, the approach markers absent from their posts. The federal restoration team had assessed the site twice since the arrest, and the reconstruction timeline was still being finalized. It looked the way places look when something has been taken from them that has not yet been replaced. Frank was standing outside the hangar when I pulled up. He was holding a cup of coffee in one hand and had the other tucked into the front pocket of his jacket, and he watched me get out of the truck with the expression of a man who has been waiting and is relieved the waiting is over. "Morning, Mr. Cole," he said. "Frank." I looked at the hangar. The door had been rehung on temporary hardware after the demolition crew tore it from its hinges, and it sat slightly uneven in the frame, letting a thin line of morning light through along the left edge. "What did you find?" He set his coffee on the hood of his truck and walked to the side of the hangar without answering, stopping at a section of the exterior wall where a low shelf had been built into the structure years ago for storing tie-down equipment. Behind a coil of rope and a rusted fuel coupling that had been sitting there since the previous decade, he reached back and pulled out a cardboard box, the kind that copy paper comes in its lid, held down with a single piece of masking tape that had gone yellow at the edges. He held it out toward me. "Derek told the crew to clear everything out of the hangar before they started on the plane," Frank said. "Personal effects tools, anything that wasn't bolted down. They were stacking it by the gate for disposal." He looked at the box. "I pulled this one before it got to the pile. I didn't look inside. I just knew it was yours, and it didn't belong in a disposal pile, so I put it back here and I—" He stopped, pressed his lips together. "I should have told you sooner. I wasn't sure it was the right time until now." I took the box from him. The masking tape gave way with a dry tearing sound when I pulled it back. I lifted the lid and looked inside. The album was on top. Dark blue cover, the kind with the magnetic pages that were popular in the 1980s, its spine soft with age. Beneath it were 3 loose photographs in a white envelope, a small framed picture that had sat on the desk in the hangar office for as long as I could remember. And at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of cloth I recognized as the bandana Eleanor always kept in the Beaver's cockpit, for wiping the windscreen, a folded piece of paper. I opened the album first. Eleanor looked back at me from the first page. "Our wedding?" She was laughing in the way she laughed when something had genuinely surprised her into happiness. Her whole face committed to it, nothing held back. I was beside her, looking at her instead of the camera, the way I apparently spent most of our wedding, looking at her according to anyone who was there, which I had never seen any reason to apologize for. The second page stopped me. It was a photograph I had not known existed, Derek at 8 years old, taken from a different angle than the print I carried in my pocket. Wider in frame, the Beaver filling more of the background, with its propeller catching the morning light. In this version, his head was turned slightly to the left, looking at something outside the frame, rather than straight into the sun, and the expression on his face was not the squinting grin I remembered. It was something quieter, something that looked from this distance like wonder. My hands were not as steady as I would have liked them to be. I turned another page. Derek at 12, sitting in the Beaver's cockpit with the door open and his feet hanging out, holding the yoke with both hands and grinning the grin of a boy who has just been told he can touch something he has always been told to look at from a distance. Eleanor standing beside the hangar in her good coat, the one she wore to church and to graduations, shading her eyes with one hand and looking up at something above the frame. Frank himself, younger by 20 years, standing beside the fuel truck with his arms crossed and a look of long-suffering patience that I recognized as the expression he reserved for the days I pushed the maintenance schedule further than he thought was wise. I closed the album. The bandana-wrapped piece of paper at the bottom of the box was a note in Eleanor's handwriting, dated 3 years before she died. It was addressed to no one in particular, which was how she wrote when she was writing for herself rather than for an audience. It said, "The runway will outlast all of us, but the people who loved what it stood for, that is the part worth keeping." I stood in the ruined hangar with the box in my hands, and the morning light coming through the uneven door frame in that thin, crooked line, and something in my chest broke open in a way that had been building since April, and probably longer than that if I was honest about it. Frank took one step toward me, and then stopped, understanding with the instinct of a man who had known me for 20 years that what was needed was proximity rather than intervention. I did not try to hold it back. I stood there in the hangar where the Beaver used to be, and I let it come, and Frank stood 4 feet away with his hands in his pockets, and his eyes on the middle distance, and neither of us said anything for a while. And that was exactly right. When I was ready, I closed the box and held it against my chest. "Frank," I said. My voice came out rough at the edges, which I did not try to correct. "Why did you wait until now?" He looked at the floor for a moment. Then he picked up his coffee from the hood of the truck, took a slow sip, and looked at me with the directness he had always brought to things that mattered. "Because you needed to get through the hard part first," he said, "before you were ready to remember the good part." The federal courthouse in Billings was a building that took itself seriously. Heavy stone exterior, tall windows, the kind of lobby where your footsteps echo regardless of how quietly you are trying to walk. I had been inside it twice before in my life, both times for matters that had nothing to do with my family. Walking through the front doors on the first morning of Derek's trial with the cardboard box under my arm felt like crossing a threshold that I had been moving toward for a very long time without knowing it. Maggie met me in the hallway outside the courtroom. She looked at the box and did not ask about it, which was one of the many things I appreciated about her. "How are you feeling?" she said. "Ready?" I said. "Which is different from fine, but it will do." She nodded once and pushed open the courtroom door. The trial ran for 11 days. I will not account for every hour of it, because the truth is that most of a federal trial is procedural and repetitive in ways that serve important legal purposes, but do not make for clear storytelling. What I will tell you is what mattered, and what mattered happened in layers, one witness at a time, each one adding weight to something that had been building since January. Arthur Pembroke came first. He brought the certified federal survey maps and the original 1973 construction records and spent 2 hours on the stand walking the jury through 40 years of ownership history with the patient precision of a man who understood that the truth was in the details and the details needed to be exact. The defense attempted twice to suggest the federal classification had lapsed through non-use. Arthur produced maintenance invoices, federal inspection records, and a letter dated 18 months earlier confirming the active operational status of the corridor. The defense did not attempt a third suggestion. Diane Kowalski came next. She presented the shell company documentation, the layered transfers, the Delaware registration, the contingent payment structure, and the 847 transfer attempt the morning after the demolition. She explained each element in plain language, and I watched the jury follow her explanation with the focused attention of people who were beginning to understand not just what Derek had done, but how carefully he had planned it. Vanessa testified on the fourth day. She walked to the stand in a gray suit, with her hands clasped in front of her, and she answered every question in a voice that was quiet but did not waver. When the prosecution played 3 minutes of audio from her recordings, Derek's voice in his own kitchen, in his own words, discussing the forged documents and the shell company and the timeline for moving the money, the courtroom went very still in the way that rooms go still when something that cannot be taken back has just been said in front of everyone. Russell Greer followed. He testified about the morning of the demolition, the instructions he received, and the moment Derek pulled the federal marker from the ground and read its inscription aloud. The prosecution played 40 seconds of this bulldozer footage. Nobody in the courtroom moved while it ran. Bobby testified on the 7th day. He was 19 years old, and he sat in the witness box in a jacket that was slightly too large for his shoulders, and explained EXIF metadata and GPS coordinates and timestamp cross-referencing to 12 jurors with the calm clarity of someone who had practiced explaining something complicated to people who needed to understand it. One juror in the second row leaned forward during his testimony and did not lean back until he was finished. I was the last witness called. I walked to the stand carrying the cardboard box, and I set it on the railing in front of me rather than on the floor, and the judge looked at it briefly but said nothing. Maggie had told me the prosecution would keep my testimony focused on the operational history of the airstrip and its role in regional rescue operations. That was what I gave them in precise and specific terms, because precision was what the moment required. When the defense cross-examined me, the attorney asked whether my actions throughout the investigation had been motivated by a desire for revenge against my son. I looked at him steadily. If revenge had been my motivation, I said I would have confronted Derek the night I found the email on his laptop. I would have called every person he had ever done business with. I would have made certain that his version of events never reached a single newspaper before mine did. I folded my hands on the railing. Instead, I called my attorney, I waited, and I preserved the evidence. Those are not the actions of a man seeking revenge. They are the actions of a man who believes the truth is sufficient given enough time and the right forum. The defense had no follow-up question. The prosecution asked me one final question before they released me from the stand. They asked whether I wanted to say anything else to the court. I lifted the lid of the cardboard box. I took out the album and opened it to the first page and held it up so the jury could see Eleanor laughing at our wedding. And then I turned to the second page and held that one up as well. Derek at 8 years old on the fence rail, arms out the whole morning ahead of him. I did not say anything for a moment. I did not need to. This is what was in the box, Derek ordered, thrown away, I said. I am not telling you this to generate sympathy. I am telling you because it is relevant to the question of what my son understood about the value of what he was destroying. I closed the album carefully and set it back in the box. He understood exactly what it was worth. He threw it away anyway. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they came back, Derek stood at the defense table with his hands at his sides and his face arranged into a stillness that I recognized as the same expression he had worn since childhood, when he was determined not to let anyone see what he was feeling. The clerk began reading. Count 1. Guilty. Count 2. Guilty. The reading continued in that same flat, steady rhythm, charge after charge, the word guilty arriving each time with the particular weight of something that has been true for a long time and is only now being said aloud in a room where it counts. I sat in the gallery and held the cardboard box in my lap and listened to every word. The sentencing hearing was 3 weeks after the verdict on a gray November morning, when the first snow of the season had come down overnight and left everything outside the courthouse looking clean and temporary. I had not slept well. I lay awake for most of the night before in the same house I had lived in for 23 years, listening to the wind come off the mountains and move through the pine trees at the edge of the yard. And I thought about all the things that had happened since January and whether I had done them right and whether doing them right had mattered as much as I believed it would. I did not arrive at any conclusions I had not already reached, but the process of going through them again felt necessary, the way pre-flight checks feel necessary, even when you already know the aircraft is sound. I drove to Billings in the dark and parked 2 blocks from the courthouse and sat in the truck for a while with the engine off, watching the city come to life around me in the gray pre-dawn light. A delivery truck made its rounds. A woman walked a dog along the salted sidewalk, her breath coming in small white clouds. The ordinary world going about its ordinary business, indifferent to what was about to happen inside the building at the end of the block. Bobby called at 7:15. "I'm already here," he said. "Second floor. Maggie is with me." "I'll be up in a few minutes," I said. "Grandpa." A pause. "How are you doing?" I looked at the courthouse through the windshield. Heavy stone exterior. Tall windows. The kind of building that had been built to last and knew it. "I am ready for this to be over," I said. "That is the most honest answer I have." "Me too," he said quietly. Me too. I found Maggie and Bobby in the hallway outside the courtroom. Maggie handed me a coffee without being asked, which was the kind of thing she did that I had long since stopped being surprised by. Bobby was wearing the same jacket that had been slightly too large for his shoulders at the trial, and he had not fixed that, and I found that I did not want him to. There was something right about it. Derek stood at the defense table in a suit that fit him well, and looked at the judge with the same careful stillness he had maintained throughout the trial. His attorney had submitted letters of support and a sentencing memorandum arguing for leniency on the grounds that Derek had no prior criminal record and had acted however misguidedly out of concern for his family's financial future. The prosecution responded with a damage summary that the judge read in full before he said a single word to anyone. Federal property losses $3.9 million. Raymond Cole's personal losses, including the aircraft and destroyed equipment, $1.4 million. Environmental remediation costs. Emergency corridor disruption affecting 3 mountain rescue districts for 7 months. Digital evidence recovery. Temporary replacement facility construction funded by the federal government. Total restitution figure $8.5 million to be pursued through Derek's personal assets, the seized proceeds of the shell company, the development firm's liability exposure, and Russell Greer's demolition company insurance. The judge looked at Derek over the top of his glasses. Mr. Cole, he said, the court has considered the letters submitted on your behalf and the arguments made by your counsel. It has also considered the evidence presented at trial which established beyond reasonable doubt that you did not act out of confusion or misunderstanding. You acted with deliberation. You forged documents. You destroyed federal property. You attempted to manipulate witnesses and move money within hours of committing the central offense. He set the papers down. The court finds no basis for the leniency requested. Derek received 12 years in federal prison. The words landed in the courtroom with a weight that was different from the weight of the verdict 3 weeks earlier. The verdict had been about what Derek had done. The sentence was about what it would cost him, measured in years of his life, and there was a particular kind of heaviness to that arithmetic that I had not anticipated and did not know what to do with except sit very still and let it be what it was. Before the hearing concluded, the judge invited me to address the court. I had prepared nothing written. I stood up from the gallery and walked to the podium and looked at Derek across the room. He looked back at me. For the first time since April, he held my gaze without looking away. I gripped the edge of the podium once, steadying myself, and then I let go of it. I asked the court in my written submission not to pursue restitution through the homes of people who did not knowingly participate in this, I said. That includes Vanessa and Bobby. Whatever debt exists here was created by one person's choices, and it should be carried by that one person to the extent the law allows. I paused. I also want to say something directly to my son if the court will permit it. The judge nodded. I looked at Derek. I did not come here to watch you lose, I said. I came because the truth required a place to be stated clearly, and this was that place. What happens to you now is the result of what you chose to do, not what I chose to do in response. I gripped the edge of the podium once, then released it. I meant what I said at your house. The boy in that photograph is still real. He always will be. And if you spend the years ahead of you finding your way back to something that resembles him, that is not a small thing. That is, in fact, the only thing that matters now. Derek's jaw moved. His eyes were bright in a way I had not seen in a long time, and he pressed his lips together and looked down at the table, and I understood that was the most he was able to give in that room, in front of all those people, and I accepted it. I walked back to my seat. Bobby was sitting 2 rows behind me. When I sat down, he reached forward and gripped my shoulder once without saying anything, and I put my hand over his briefly, and that was enough. Vanessa was in the back row. I had not known she was coming. She was alone, and when the hearing concluded and people began to move toward the exits, she caught my eye across the room and held it for a moment. And then she nodded once slowly, the way people nod when there are no words that would add anything useful to what has already been said. I nodded back. That was all. That was sufficient. Outside the courthouse, the snow that had fallen overnight was beginning to melt at the edges of the sidewalks, the clean white giving way to gray slush where the foot traffic had been heaviest. Maggie walked beside me to the parking lot without speaking, which was one of the things I had always valued most about her. The understanding that some moments did not require commentary to be complete. At my truck, she stopped and looked at me. "Raymond," she said, "for what it's worth, you did this right. Every step of it." "We did it right," I said. "There is a difference." She almost smiled. "Go home," she said. "Get some rest. It's over." It was not entirely over. The legal process would continue for months in its various forms: the financial proceedings, the asset recovery, the dissolution of the shell company, the separate civil actions involving the development firm. But the part of it that had required me to carry it personally, to hold it steady and intact, while it found its way to the place where it could be properly examined, that part was finished. I drove home through the gray November morning and sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee that I did not drink, and looked at the mountains through the window and thought about Eleanor and whether she would have said, "I told you so," about any of this, and decided she would not have. She would have sat across the table from me and held my hand and said that the hard part was done, and what came next was up to us. She was right about most things. I believed she would have been right about that too. The reconstruction of the airstrip began in December, funded in part by seized assets and restitution payments with the federal government, covering the remainder in recognition of the corridor's operational importance to the region. Frank Dalton oversaw the site work with the focused satisfaction of a man reclaiming something that had been taken from him personally. The new runway surface was poured in February. The lighting system went in 2 weeks later. The hangar was rebuilt with better insulation and a proper heating system, because Frank had complained about the cold for 15 years, and I had finally run out of reasons to disagree with him. The section of the Beaver's wing that still bore the bulldozer's tread marks was mounted on the interior wall of the new hangar, at Frank's suggestion, at a height where it could be seen from anywhere in the building. Frank drilled the mounting brackets himself and leveled them with the particular care he brought to everything structural, and when it was done, he stepped back and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. "Looks right," he said finally. "It does," and I agreed. The replacement aircraft arrived in late February, a newer model better instrumented, better suited to the demands of the mountain missions the corridor was built to support. I ran through the systems check 3 times before I was satisfied, which Frank observed from the hangar doorway with the expression of a man who expected nothing less and had brought a second cup of coffee to see him through the wait. The first operational flight was on a Thursday morning in early March. Sheriff Dale Hale came out, and Agent Reyes and Arthur Pembroke and Maggie and Carol Sutton with her notepad, and Bobby, who had driven down from Missoula the night before and slept on my couch. Pastor Glenn stood at the edge of the new perimeter fence with his hands in his coat pockets and his face turned into the wind. Frank handed me my flight bag at the hangar door. "Weather's good," he said. "Visibility unlimited. It usually is," I said, "when you can finally see clearly." He almost smiled. I pulled on my jacket and walked to the aircraft. The engine caught on the first try. I taxied to the runway threshold and ran the checklist with the same deliberate attention I had brought to every pre-flight for 50 years, because that discipline was the thing that had kept me alive in the air, and it was the thing that had kept me standing on the ground through everything that had happened since January, and I saw no reason to treat it as anything less than what it was. I released the brakes and let the aircraft roll. The runway passed beneath me, clean and whole, and then it fell away, and the mountains came up on either side, and the valley opened below, and I banked north toward the rescue corridor and looked down at the land once before I turned my eyes forward. The airstrip was there. Small from this altitude, precise, the new fencing catching the morning light in a clean line along its perimeter. The hangar, the access road, the sign at the gate large enough now that no one could miss it from the road below. I did not look for the golf course that was never built. There was nothing there to see. Some things, when they are gone, leave a mark. Some things leave nothing at all because they were never real enough to leave anything behind. Derek had built his plan on land that was never his, with money that was never earned, toward a future that the law had already foreclosed before the first bulldozer crossed the gate. What remained when it collapsed was what had always been there: the mountains, the corridor, the work that needed doing, and the people who showed up to do it. I looked ahead at the mountains instead, patient and indifferent as always, and I flew. I have told you this family story, not because I wanted your sympathy, but because I believe the truth is worth the time it takes to tell it correctly. Here is what I learned, and what I wish someone had said to me before any of this began: the people who love you will not always protect you from pain. Sometimes the deepest pain comes from the people who were supposed to love you most. I do not say that with bitterness. I say it because it is true, and because God does not promise us easy roads, only that we will not walk them entirely alone. If you take anything from this grandpa stories today, let it be this: do not let grief make your decisions. Do not let anger write your next chapter. And whatever you are facing, preserve the truth carefully, because the truth, given enough time, always finds the room where it matters. These are the grandpa stories I never planned to tell, but I'm glad I told this one. Every family story worth keeping has a cost. This one was mine. If something in this family story stayed with you, leave a comment below. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and consider subscribing so you never miss what comes next. Thank you sincerely for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. The stories that follow contain fictional elements crafted purely for reflection and insight. If that is not what you are looking for today, no hard feelings. Find what speaks to you.